In this video, I'm going to show you the basic workflow I use for treating photos in Lightroom. Now, I'm going to say right off the bat, I don't actually do that much in Lightroom as I've developed my photography and treatment post-processing. I find more and more I just use Lightroom for culling, going through shots, finding the good ones, eliminating the bad ones, and more often than not, things I used to do in Lightroom, I now solely do in Photoshop simply because it's non-destructive and it gives me a lot more control. But, you know, for the stuff that's quick, stuff that doesn't need a lot of work, if I'm in a rush and I want to get a good basic treatment, Lightroom's great. There's certainly nothing wrong with it. But obviously, anything you do in here in terms of exposure, highlights, vignettes, that kind of thing, it's baked into the image. Obviously, you can work with the Adobe Camera Raw filter in Photoshop, convert it to a smart object, and then you don't have to bake these settings in. But if you're working with Lightroom and you want to know the approach I use for photos for ToyShooter, this is what I do. So I've just picked an image to work on. In this case, we've got Wonder Woman here. Probably the first thing I do is look at exposure. Now, this seems okay. If you look at the histogram, it's a little on the dark side. So I might nudge that down a touch. Sorry, up to bring it up. But obviously, I'm risking wrecking the highlights there. But invariably, what I will do is bring the highlights down so I can recover anything that's sort of too hot, and indeed bring the shadows up so I can work in some of the detail in the shadow areas that I might have lost. So obviously that makes the image quite flat, so I might compensate for that a little by nudging the whites up and the blacks down. But really I want to mostly use Lightroom on the raw file to get that highlight and shadow detail back in the image. And then, I'd add more contrast really in Photoshop with dodging and burning. That's kind of the approach I use. Now, one thing I always do is I almost invariably always use Vibrance here. So it's kind of a manual thing, but I'll just play with that and sort of see where I'm comfortable leaving it before it wrecks the image too much. This one, that's looking about okay. Could go a little bit higher, but I don't want to do too much because I'm going to do color grading in Photoshop later, so I don't need to worry too much about the colors. Here, never really touch saturation for toy photography. Colors are always very saturated anyway. I don't touch tone curve. Again, that's kind of a Photoshop thing for me to be mucking around with that. Same here with saturation, color. I do, however, do sharpening in Photoshop. I think it's really, really good. So I'll normally work on sharpening in conjunction with noise reduction. So if I usually do it quite high, so I'd normally go to about 80. If you zoom in on the video, you can see I'm just sort of starting to bring out some of the noise really, really bad here. So normally with noise reduction, I normally go for around 40 to 50. Obviously, this is very, very specific to the results I'm getting off my camera. Normally, I shoot at about ISO 100. I try and go as low as I can go with ISO, either 100 or 200. So the amount of noise I'm getting is reflective of that. My scenes are quite brightly lit, so I can shoot at smaller apertures, shorter shutter speeds, and with a low ISO. So I get a really, really clean image. So these settings aren't going to work for you if you have different settings in camera. But as a general rule of thumb, I'll have sharpening a little bit higher than noise reduction. And then vignette. Used to do vignette in Lightroom. It's very tempting to stick a vignette on, but once you've done that, you've baked it in the image. So I tend not to do vignettes in Lightroom. I just touch those kind of settings there. Sometimes I'll muck around with color temperature a little bit as well, depending on if the camera's got the white balance wrong. But apart from that, it's just highlight, shadows, whites and blacks. I don't touch contrast. I rarely touch exposure. In this case, I have Vibrance up, then sharpening, noise reduction, that's it. Then I simply grab the image, right click, export. I do same folder as original photo, keep the same file name, and then I just always export to PSD. And then I'll open this up straight in Photoshop and start working on it. So that is my entire workflow for Lightroom. As I say, I don't really do much with Lightroom. For me, it's just more a bridge for getting to Photoshop. But if you're interested, that's what I do. Hope you found this helpful. For more tips and tutorials, including lots and lots of techniques in Photoshop that I use, make sure you subscribe to the channel and head over to ToyShooter.com and you can pick up our free toy photography guide, and there's plenty of other tutorials, articles and videos there as well. Thanks for watching.